Good afternoon and welcome to today's special Made by McGill alumni webcast, Sudan in Crisis. My name is Derek Hassoff, Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and it's Tuesday, May 9th, 2023. 4 years ago, the world watched in awe as a popular revolt in Sudan managed to chase its autocratic dictator, Omar al-Bashir, from power after a brutal 30-year reign, ushering in what many hoped would be a new period of peace and democracy in Africa's third largest nation. But last month, just days before the military was set to turn over power to a civilian government, the country instead erupted in unprecedented violence as two generals vying for power turned their guns on each other, catching millions of civilians in the crossfire. Hundreds have been killed, tens of thousands have fled their homes, and the international community is left to wonder what went wrong. Joining me today to discuss these latest developments and what they might mean for the prospects of peace and security in Sudan and across North Africa more broadly is Khalid Mustafa Medani, Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies and Chair of McGill's Africa Studies program. Professor Medani is himself a Sudanese national who fled the country in the early days of Omar al-Bashir's rule and has become one of the world's leading scholars on the intersection of religion, politics, and history in Sudan and its surrounding region. Welcome, Professor Medani, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today on an issue that I know is dear to your heart.
Thank you so much, Derek. If you don't mind me using your first name, it's a real honor to be part of this broadcast, and also just really honored that you've taken the time and your concern for Sudan and those who've joined us. So I'm very, very pleased and honored by this invitation.
Well, it's great to have you, and I think that's a concern that's shared by many Canadians and certainly many McGill alumni who are watching the developments in the news. Before we begin, and I have a whole bunch of questions for you, just a reminder that if you are watching us live and you have any questions for Professor Medani, you can email us at aoc@mcgill.ca, and we'll be sure to put them to our guest. So to begin, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what the situation is like on the ground in Sudan this week.
Well, this week, it's now in the fourth week. The fighting in the capital of Khartoum began on April 15th. And the crisis has only, unfortunately, accelerated. The human rights crisis is huge. The humanitarian crisis is extremely drastic for a number of reasons. One of them is that most of the violence is at the very heart of the capital city. In Africa's third largest country, one of the largest capital cities in the continent of Africa, with upwards of 8 million people. And so when this conflict began, this power struggle between these two generals, one of them the head of the National Army by the name of General Abdel Fattah Burhan, and the other who's the head of this very powerful paramilitary militia, Hemeti, Mohammed Hamdan Hemeti. It began on April 15th, and it accelerated very quickly in the sense of aerial bombardments, street battles. But now the problem has reached a breaking point, so to speak, in humanitarian terms. People do not have access to basic food supplies, to clean water. It doesn't matter if you even have the financing, you can't access cash. And so it began with a problem of food insecurity, people caught in the crossfire, but now it's on the brink of famine, even at the very heart of the capital city. And as you mentioned in your introduction, about 100,000 Sudanese have been forced to leave their homes and flee to neighboring countries. Upwards of, at this point, 800 have been killed as a result of the kind of crossfire. And there are different pockets of violence around the country, but it's really at the very heart of the capital city. This has not happened in Sudan in its history since its independence in 1956. So it's a deep, deep, drastic humanitarian crisis, as you probably are aware.
Right. So before we jump into some of the broader questions about what is happening or I should say why it's happening and where we go from here, I just wanted to get a bit of a sort of personal perspective from you. I mentioned that you are from Sudan initially yourself. Are you in touch with family and friends back in the country, and are they safe? Have any of them managed to flee the country?
Yes, I'm in touch with them on a daily basis, about 2 or 3 times a year. I have a lot of different identities, and the central one has always been Sudanese. I'm also an American citizen. Of course, I've lived in Canada for a number of years, but Sudan is very dear to my heart because the privileges that I've received have been from my country and the support I've gathered from my relatives and family, as you can imagine. So I'm very much in touch with family. Only 3 days ago, we were finally able to get my mother and my brother out to Egypt. We got a lot of support from Sudanese relatives in the north, where I'm from, the villages of the north. Just an example of how people really work hard to help each other, and that's how people get by in Sudan. And also many Egyptian friends who took the time to make phone calls and help my mother get out. I have uncles and cousins and others in Khartoum itself. Some have managed to get out, and some, believe it or not, have refused to leave. My uncle has refused to leave, and we're very close. He's been my mentor growing up in a variety of different ways, intellectually as well. But he does not want to leave his home. And many people do not want to leave their home. And as many as people who have left, in the hundreds of thousands, I just want to make sure to remind everyone, of course, that the millions remain in the capital city. So, of course, it's very concerning for all of us.
Right. So for those of us who are maybe less familiar with the recent political history of Sudan, maybe you can explain to us a little bit about, how the events of the last few years have transpired, beginning with the ouster of Omar al-Bashir, which was, I think, a pretty dramatic event at the time. What has happened in the 4 years since that have led us to the situation that we are seeing today and the violence that is, just recently erupted?
Well, absolutely. I've done a lot of interviews, as you can imagine, with respect to this present conflict. But 4 years ago, in December 2018 and 2019, I was telling my sisters that I was giving interviews in a much more, let's say, optimistic way. And I was lecturing to my McGill undergraduates in a far more optimistic way about Sudan. And that was because after 30 years of a very strong authoritarian regime that was Islamist fundamentalist at its core, at least in the early years, you had a revolution for democracy, where millions of people protested not only in the capital city, but throughout the country. No country in Africa or the Arab world had experienced that to that level. 6 months of persistent protests by young people who just were tired of authoritarianism, tired about their religion being used for instrumental political purposes, and tired about an economic crisis in a very, very resource-rich country. And so in December 2018, that pro-democracy movement began. April 11th, they managed to oust the dictator, Omar Bashir. And following that, the protest persisted. But the problems that we see today also began. In August of 2019, there was a very precarious coalition government that was brokered by the international community that combined both civilian and military leaders. Many would say that that was the first mistake that set the stage for what was to happen, because it gave veto, authority to military leaders that were supposed to see a transition to democratic rule. And so following that, there were a great deal of protests. And on October 2021, the military leader, Burhan of the army, in conjunction with his partner at the time, the head of the paramilitary force, Hemeti, the two who are now battling to the death in Khartoum and holding the entire country hostage, they waged a coup against the democracy and the democratic movement. And it's really at that kind of beginning that we begin to see the spiral of these kind of conflicts, because following that coup, believe it or not, the protest began. I want to impress on your listeners and everyone who's interested that the pro-democracy movement was not stalled. Young people on a daily basis continued to protest. And that, of course, also was recognized by the United States, by Saudi Arabia, the UK, Norway, and the United Nations. What happened, if you don't mind me saying, is that these young people basically impressed upon some of the most powerful countries in the world their will for democracy, to the point where the international community changed course and decided to force this general and his deputy at the time, Hemeti, to come back to the table. They brokered yet another agreement called the Framework Agreement, insisting, and the United States and Saudi Arabia took the lead, insisting that there must be a transition to a civilian democracy once again. It is in that context that both generals calculated that their political fortunes and economic fortunes were coming to an end. And the real sticking point becomes between them, as many of you would understand, those listening, and that is the issue of security sector reform. put very simply and directly, the debate or disagreement between them had to do with the stipulation and the agreement brokered by the international community that the paramilitary militias had to be integrated into the armed forces, to have one standing army in order to stabilize the country and oversee the country to democracy. It's at that point, Derek, that what happened is that both of them were very jealous and of their power, and they were about to do everything that they could to retain their power. On the part of Hemeti, who's the head of the paramilitary militia, he refused to integrate. He said he'd do it in 10 years. The head of the army, Burhan, said it had to be done in 2 years. In a nutshell, what happened, both of them wanted to retain their autonomy. Both of them wanted to manipulate the transition to retain power and also to retain their vast wealth that they had, amassed in the previous authoritarian regime. And it is at that point, on April 15th, that, or even a few days before, that the paramilitary militia headed by Hemeti mobilized not only in outlying regions, but most tragically in the capital itself, among residential areas, bases near hotels, near factories, near people's houses. And when the conflict began, it then turned into this conflict between the army using jet fighters and airplanes and street battles waged by these militia forces using people's homes and their own physical bodies as human shields. And that kind of insecurity had never happened in Sudan. Rarely has it happened even in the African context, in the capital city. And immediately within a week, you had hundreds of thousands fleeing across borders of Chad, of Egypt, Ethiopia, South Sudan, even Libya. A country that's bordering 7 countries found itself now on the brink of collapse and threatening the entire stability of the region.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thanks for that incredible description of the events of the last 4 years. But I want to come back to the role of the international community. But before I do that, just as a point of clarity, you mentioned these 2 generals, Al-Burhan and Hemeti. I mean, do they represent different clans or tribal factions, or is this simply a power play between 2 gentlemen who want to be president?
That's a great question, Derek. I'm asked that often because I think a lot of incidences of conflict are ethnically based. This is one of those cases that it's not ethnically based. It really are 2 generals who, believe it or not, do not have any constituency, and that's part of their problem. As I've said in other shows and even to students, authoritarianism sometimes actually stabilizes the political system, unfortunately, for those of us who care about democracy. In this case, that has not been possible precisely because they don't, neither of them have a constituency, neither has an ethnic base. In the case of Hemeti, he is a mercenary, like the Wagner Group, for example, and he does not rely on ideology or ethnicity for recruitment. He literally relies on funding, on money, paying mercenaries from Sudan and other countries in the Sahel region to fight for his own personal cause, so to speak. In the case of Burhan, previously he had the constituency of the Islamist movement organized under the National Congress Party, but now at this point, that movement has eroded a great deal because of its past history and its sheer unpopularity among the Sudanese people. So this is why it's taken on this very kind of interpersonal battle. Even though they do have forces behind them, they don't have a constituency in civil society. And this is the main reason neither of them has been able to stabilize and gain complete control in the Weberian sense, what we tell our students, the kind of legitimate monopoly of violence over territory, right? They're not able to do that because of their lack of constituency. So it represents a very different form of conflict from the kind of civil conflicts we're familiar with in Africa.
Wow, very interesting. So just to get back to the international community, you detailed a few examples and mentioned a few countries, the United States and Saudi Arabia in particular, as well as Norway, that have, tried in the last 4 years to broker some sort of, transition to democracy in Sudan. So I guess I have a 2-part question. Why do you think the international community was so involved in the process? And I guess more significantly, how did these efforts get derailed in the end?
Well, they were involved in the process. I'm going to put it out there. They were involved in the process because they had to. First of all, all of their neighboring countries and the external actors like the United States understand the strategic kind of positioning and location of Sudan. For those who are not familiar with that, with Sudan, it, as I said, borders 7 countries, and even more significantly, it borders the Sahel region, which is so important geostrategically for France and for the United States. And even more significantly, of course, it borders the Red Sea. The port along the Red Sea is strategic, not only for the United States, but for Saudi Arabia, for Russia, for Turkey, for Qatar, for China. It's an unbelievably strategically located country. The devolution of a country like Sudan into chaos undermines not only, of course, the life chances of Sudanese, but also the interest of the external actors, neighboring and external. In the context of the pro-democracy revolution, basically it was such a strong kind of popular pro-democracy revolution that even though some of the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, wanted to forestall it and support the military leaders at the time, the pro-democracy movement was too strong, and the United States and the African Union decided belatedly that they would follow the lead of the pro-democracy activists and broker a transition to a civilian democracy. So that was the reason the commitment, particularly on the part of the United States, becomes so important as part and parcel of not only a transition to a civilian democracy, but also to have a strong democratic civilian government as an ally in the region, in the context where Russia is looking for a port on the Red Sea, China imports oil from South Sudan that goes through Sudan, the list goes on. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates also have joint operations on the Red Sea, and they have investments in Sudan. So all of these countries are scrambling in a way to safeguard their interest. Each, of course, has a different agenda, and right now they're in the context of negotiating some kind of ceasefire, but that's not happening at the moment.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to ask you specifically about the role of Russia and China on the African continent, because I think it speaks to the bigger picture. But let's hold that for a second. I have a couple more questions to get to before that. But even before, if you are watching live and you have any questions that you want to put to Professor Medani, you can email them to us at aoc@mcgill.ca. We did get a couple that have come in, so I'll get to them shortly. Before we turn to Russia, China, the big picture, I just want to sort of circle back to the notion of the Arab Spring, and you mentioned that earlier. We're only about a dozen years removed from the Arab Spring, and we remember those remarkable street protests that shook North Africa and Egypt, Tunisia, elsewhere across the Middle East and North Africa. And yet, to an outside observer here in Canada, it feels like the civilian populations who were on the streets seeking more freedoms are not faring any better than those of previous generations. And again, we're seeing this play out now in Sudan under sort of different circumstances. But I'm wondering if this suggests to you that this is a region that is just stuck in a perpetual cycle of violence and autocracy. And is this the prism that we should be looking through when observing the recent developments in Sudan?
Well, I never think about it in those terms. I mean, I prefer to think about analyzing the causes of why you have such hard authoritarian states that have stood against pro-democracy protests and movements. I think that there are a couple of reasons. In the region itself is a region that's heavily militarized historically, and the balance between the military forces and civil society has always been weak. That has been a result of domestic factors, but also a result of the fact that the region is in one of the most contested regions in the world. I don't have to probably tell you that the arms trade in the Middle East region and North Africa is the largest in the entire world, if you relate it to other forms of trade, for example. So it's a guns and butter situation. And so the pro-democracy movements and youth in particular, who number the majority of young people in the country, have a legacy of militarization that they have to contend with. They also, if you don't mind me saying, have a legacy of countries that are supported externally, financially, by their benefactors in the period of the Cold War and after. Analyzing that enables us to understand, number one, that the obstacles to democratization have been a legacy of militarization, weak and divided civil societies, and in addition to that, external patronage to military leaders. That history allows us to go forward and try to understand, A, why it hasn't worked, but B, why young people continue to protest. We are no longer at a stage when we're talking about protest in North Africa and in the Middle East leading to democracy overnight, where we talk about, as analysts now, persistent protest. A culture of persistent protest, Derek, in the sense of what we really need to focus on are these incremental changes. It's a learning process of a political culture of young people who have broken the ceiling in terms of accepting authoritarianism absent any critique or protest. That to me, I know it's difficult to imagine, but that to me is great progress for someone who studied this region for 30 years, in the sense it's, that notion of authoritarianism that is able to provide the basic services and public goods that satisfied the population in the past for a variety of economic reasons is dwindling away. And what we're seeing in every country are persistent protests, not calling for democracy, but calling for food security, calling for better wages, calling for women's rights, calling for those kind of things that are usually don't capture the headlines. And so I see that even in Sudan today, in Khartoum, where young people are the ones actually providing the basic services provisions, volunteering. And we can talk about at length, and I can give you multiple examples. And this is what we should focus on, not the outcome in the far future, but really the daily lives and progress of young people in particular, that number maybe 60% of the population in all these countries.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting and I guess optimistic point. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that younger generation. And it's true, because if you compare, the developing world and countries like Sudan to those like, here in North America and Europe, I mean, these are very young populations where you have well more than 50% of the population are young people. So how is that younger generation mobilizing? And is this, a long-term strategy to perhaps finally bring, democracy to many of these countries?
I think so. I think one of the reasons that these uprisings captured the attention of so many people is the sheer similarity of these young people to their, sisters and brothers in Canada and elsewhere. As Canadian students and Americans followed these protests, they saw in social media something very familiar. That is, young people who are very critical of authoritarianism, very much interested in, freedoms, and also, of course, a democracy. And so that combination and the role of social media, the transnational aspect of these movements are very important. There are many elements to democratization, as scholars will tell you, and one of them is a political culture of democracy. One of them is the learning process of the possibilities of democratization and a political culture of democracy that is homegrown. That is, in previous years, there was always the propaganda that this was a Western artifact, that this is a Western intervention, a form of colonization of values. And now I think it's clear that a breakthrough has occurred, that democracy is popular in Africa and the Middle East. In Africa, the majority of countries actually are governed by democratic constitutions since the 1990s. And so the spread of that ethic of democratization and the political culture is there, and it continues to be there. I would conclude this by saying this is going to be a little provocative, but I have said previously what is happening in Sudan now, Derek, is the sheer threat of democracy, the sheer threat of democratization. These two generals fighting have done everything in their power with alliances abroad to forestall the strength of the democracy movement since 2018. You can tell an entire story, a narrative of where and how we've come here in Sudan by explaining why these young people have threatened these military generals so much, to the point where they've tried to manage a transition to retain power and discuss with external powers how to diminish the protest among young people. And there's clear evidence that that is the case.
Okay. Well, I don't find the threat of democracy to be too provocative, but maybe that's just me. So let me just go back. You mentioned Russia, China. You referenced, the old style, the Cold War. And I'm wondering, when I think about the African continent more broadly, and we hear about these sort of new actors arriving on the scene, obviously the United States has had a very long, footprint in Africa, as of countries like France, and Britain, old colonial powers. But now we hear a lot about Russia and China arriving on the continent and trying to exert their own brand of influence, either by investing, huge sums of money on infrastructure projects, often with strings attached, or propping up governments they consider favorable to their interests. So I'm wondering if these forces have played any role in the power struggle we're seeing in Sudan this month. And more broadly, does this suggest that Africa is once again becoming a front in a sort of new Cold War of sorts?
I think so. I think that it's, to put it simply, we've moved, as you know, from a bipolar to a multipolar world. The days of the U.S. being the unipolar power are long gone, and the discussions of the decline of American hegemony globally is a subject of many books and talk shows, of course. I think that there's no question that the West's influence in Africa has declined. If you look at the level of foreign direct investment as opposed to China, if you look at their strategic locations, if you look at their diplomatic efforts, and this is why recently Biden invited African leaders to Washington to try to make up for that. And of course, the vice president of the US has traveled through Africa. China and Russia are a little bit different. China utilizes both investments of a variety of types, not only focused on extractive industries, but also infrastructure. And China increasingly utilizes soft power. So the spread of China is a complicated story, and it really explains its strength and popularity among many African leaders, if not even population. That, of course, goes hand in hand with the declining influence, let's say, of France and the United States as former powers in the region. So I think that that's true. I think Russia's case is a little bit different. It's not nearly as influential as China, for example, and its threat really has to do with trying to locate strategic bases, let's say, in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea, and through the Wagner Group, which is a mercenary group that is influential, but not the most influential in comparison to China's role. So I think, having spoken to American officials, frankly, they do say quite honestly that for them, it is China's influence in Africa, and it's a great, of course, military kind of positioning across the Indian Ocean that for the United States is looking forward to the future, for them seems to be the greatest source of competition. How that fits in the Horn of Africa is key, and Sudan is central. There are very few countries like Sudan where China is interested because of the oil going through the country. The Wagner Group is interested because of the gold mine smuggled through Syria to the Wagner Group in the Ukraine. The United States is very concerned about the Port Sea and that strategic area, which is such an important source of trading globally for the global economy. So I want to once again, I'm beating a dead horse perhaps, but to just emphasize the geostrategic location of a country that also has gold, oil, water resources, which is so important for the upstream Nile countries, Ethiopia and Egypt. And so here, you can tell that story, of course, of external actors, each with own interest, but at the very heart, the Sudanese population seems to be held hostage, believe it or not, to the sheer wealth and strategic location of this country that people think is so poor in aggregate terms, but quite wealthy in terms of its resources.
Yeah, one of my initial questions was to ask you why we should care so much about what's going on in Sudan. But I think you've answered that in so many different ways, given its strategic place in the world, the resources, and its history, I think, as being a bit of a political kingmaker in that region. I'm thinking back even, to the al-Bashir years when, it was I guess Sudan was declared a state sponsor of terrorism, had harbored Osama bin Laden for many years before the 9/11 attacks. So, I mean, it's certainly been a key player for good or bad on the world stage. So let me, again, if I have a few questions that are coming from alumni, so let me turn to those. If someone is watching live and wants to try to sneak another question in here, you can send it to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca. The first question came to us from Ed Hoyer, the simple one. He asks, why can't someone get the two sides together to negotiate the problems that separate them? Simple, but maybe not so simple.
Well, negotiations are complex. Usually, in the case of these kind of conflicts, there's a pre-negotiation element and a mediation element, and usually they occur. I'm going to use my hat of being the chair of African Studies at McGill to say that usually it occurs with what we call a mutually hurting stalemate, in the sense of, in the context of a military stalemate, it opens up opportunities for mediation. And that seems to be what is happening. The first stage is pre-negotiation, and the other stage is when the third-party actors, in this case Saudi Arabia and the US, actually manage to do a couple of things, that is implement a ceasefire and manage and manipulate the expectations of the two protagonists, basically explaining to them and showing them that they have a great deal to lose rather than to gain. That can only happen, unfortunately, usually in the African context when there is a stalemate. We've seen it in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and other countries. That's extremely important. The one thing that's missing is that these actors, Saudi Arabia and the US, are bringing them together. But the problem is that the stakeholders in the negotiations seem to be very narrow. And what I mean by that is that there's an exclusion of civil society actors. Remember, we talked about this region where there's an imbalance between the military and civil society. We know also from other countries in Africa, and this is not just pie in the sky from research, that it is very important for, in the context where you have two protagonists who do not have popularity or legitimacy to the extent that they don't have in Sudan, very important to include civil society groups, political parties, women's groups, trade unions. Civil society takes different forms. Without that, you cannot have actually the implementation of ceasefires, but more importantly, rarely would you have durability in the peace settlements. And this is why in Liberia and Sierra Leone, it took two sequencing, but at the end it did occur. And that had to do with the inclusion of civil society actors as part and parcel of the negotiation. I hope that helps a little bit. I tend to talk a lot, so I apologize.
No, that's great. And thank you, Mr. Hoyer, for that question. So we got two questions have come to us from Ian McNairn, who's clearly much more well-versed and well-read on the situation than I am. So I'll put them to you. I'll start with the first question. It is, if Sudan civil society and the international community had more forcefully reacted to Sadiq al-Mahdi's overthrow in the 80s or the Darfur genocide around 2004, 2005, would we be in a better situation in Sudan today?
I think so. It's difficult, hindsight is 2020, as they say, but I would say I would begin with the first one and to kind of well, first of all, thank you, Ian, for the question and coming, because obviously you know a lot about Sudan. I think that in the period where Sadiq al-Mahdi's democratically elected government was overthrown, there was very little interest in democratization. I know that this may be counterintuitive, of a bit of a shock, despite the rhetoric of Western countries and the US in terms of promoting democracy. In that period, there was very little interest in genuinely promoting democracy for strategic reasons, and the Americans have admitted that over the years, that they prized stability over democracy. And so there was very little interest in actually penalizing those who, like Bashir, who overtook and overthrew. So I think, that is a lesson for us to really be very clear about not only the importance of democracy, but also how it can be a form of conflict resolution. That is something that I like to say over and over again. The Darfur conflict is a much more complicated conflict, because I think the international community not only it's not a matter of they did intervene, but they intervened in a very harmful way. Intervention always occurs in Africa in these conflicts. In the case of Darfur, from the very beginning, Darfur was isolated because of a variety of coalitions that were interested in policy in Darfur, particularly in Washington, the United States. That Darfur was seen to the exclusion of the problems in Khartoum, in Sudan. Almost like two countries. I remember talking to American politicians at the time and telling them that the problem in Darfur begins in Khartoum, and they said, no, we believe that these are two different things. That's a true story or anecdote. And so what we see now is that it's not the lack of intervention, it's the kind of lack of understanding of the root causes of the conflict in Darfur. It was viewed as an inter-ethnic conflict, when at the heart of it, it was a conflict between center and periphery, between central government led by an Islamist military regime that promoted, created, and paid the Janjaweed to kill 200,000 innocent civilians. And then, of course, that transition transmuted into the present paramilitary force of the Rapid Support Forces. So here, as I always tell my students, Western countries and others always intervene. Our task is to really address the proper form of intervention that's effective and successful. But there's always forms of intervention. And the do no harm policy must be taken seriously when it comes to these kind of interventions.
Great. Okay. And the second question from Ian McNairn, he's asking, who is the best civilian leader who could be an alternative to Burhan or Hemeti? Is it Hamdok or someone else that would be more forceful? And how would they assume power?
We're always looking at leadership. Hamdok, of course, is a very decent person, but he never did have the constituency in Sudan because he had been living abroad for about 30 years.
He was the transitionary leader, I believe, right? Who came in after al-Bashir, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Right.
And he was handpicked by a combination of civilian political parties and also external actors, particularly Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, who favored him, and the UK also was very supportive. The answer to that is the best civilian leader is one that has legitimacy in his society. And the proposals that were put in place before and after Hamdok's exit were that there would be a civilian prime minister that would be chosen by civil society groups who had been waging the revolution. This was ongoing in terms of the framework agreement that was signed in December of last year. The idea was there would be a constitutional conference. All those who participated in the revolution, from civil society to the exclusion of the Islamists who were, dictators in the past, would come together, and they would together actually select a legitimate leader. And that was very much in the offing. And this is one of the reasons this conflict began, because there was great success in the last days before the conflict of actually selecting a new civilian leader who was legitimate. I can give you some names, but it's probably not relevant today.
Well, maybe we'll have you back in a few months when the situation resolves, and we can talk about the prospects of that new civilian leader. This has been really, really interesting and exciting, but certainly insightful. Before I let you go, I'm just curious, how do you expect the situation to sort of evolve in the next few weeks? And I know you certainly bring a streak of optimism to most of your comments. Is there a certain sort of best case scenario that you could see playing out that could save Sudan from this current round of violence?
Well, my optimism is because I do a lot of interviews, and many Sudanese listen to me speaking, and I think that's part of my role. So I have a couple of hats. One of them is being from Sudan. I'm not sure if it is optimism in the abstract, but I try to really fall back on everything that I've learned as a political scientist, but also teaching. And that is, I look at Sudan in the context of other conflicts that have ended. There's a lot of work, Derek, in terms of on the work on how wars end. And I know it's difficult now, especially for Sudanese and even for myself, to envision the ending of a war. But I think that there's a process in which that occurs. And the way I see it, is that unfortunately this will become much worse before it gets better, because there has to be a recognition on the parties that there is a stalemate, and that is how wars have ended in other African countries. From there, and this is why doing these shows are so important, the role of the international community is crucial. Getting it right is crucial. Understanding how mediation works, and also implementing certain carrot and sticks. And here I would emphasize the sticks. So, for example, I feel, and I'm supportive of the executive order on the part of President Biden he issued last Thursday to threaten sanctions on these protagonists. Targeted, selective sanctions, not sanctions that will hurt the population, but sanctions that really look at corporations, institutions, and individuals who are responsible for this violence. From there, that kind of stick actually opens up the space for bringing other people in. And so that's really what I would recommend. I think that the final thing is, number one, to bring the civil society groups that are not talked about. And this is the biggest challenge, or the equally challenging, some kind of coherence on the part of the international community. There must be coherence in terms of shared interest on the part of the United States, Saudi Arabia, UAE. I think that's possible. Unfortunately, as the crisis deepens, that countries who are very influential are going to realize that they actually do have a shared interest in the stability of this region and this country. So that's a hopeful way to end my question, my answer.
Okay. Great. Well, that's a great perhaps optimistic answer, and maybe that is a great place to end this discussion as well. So thank you so much for all of your again insightful and instructive responses today. Before we do bring the webcast to a close, I'd like to remind our viewers that this video will be available at this very same link soon after our recording ends. So feel free to share it with others who may not have been able to tune in live. And I would, of course, like to extend my deepest gratitude to our special guest today, Professor Khalid Mustafa Medani, for joining me and providing, as I said, great insight and understanding into the latest developments in Sudan. I think that McGill University and the undergraduates who are fortunate to be in your classes are quite lucky to have someone.
Can I make a plug, Derek, if you don't mind quickly? Yeah.
Sure.
Because one of the reasons I came was to meet you, and it's always an honor to speak and to speak on Sudan. But I also wanted to tell the McGill alumni about the African Studies program at McGill. I always tell the students and faculty that even though I study very difficult parts of Africa, there are so many other things that we're doing, including cultural events, speaker series. And so I would love for the McGill alumni to join us in some of these events as we continue. And we have 3 student organizations at McGill, all of which work and support African studies at the university. And so we welcome you at any time.
Oh, that's fascinating. And we always talk about McGill being a global university, and it's just incredible to see how international in focus the university is, not just its student complement, but of course the perspective of its professoriate and sort of the outreach work that is happening and the scholarly work. So wonderful. I was going to add another plug, if you don't mind, Professor Medani. I would just say that if anyone wants to read more about your insights, you have a new book that's just come out, and I would certainly invite people to check it out. It's Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa, which last year was co-recipient of the best book on the Middle East and North Africa, awarded by the American Association of Political Science. So congratulations on that.
Thank you, Derek. Thanks. I appreciate it. I didn't expect that. Thank you. Yes.
Right. And of course, thank you everyone who tuned in today. Please continue to keep your eye on your McGill email and social media feeds over the coming weeks as we continue to share news about our exciting online and in-person programming. And until then, please be well and stay safe. Thank you.